We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
You know, I love my state of Vermont. I want you all to come on up and visit us. In the winter, you gotta bring some warm clothes, it is true. But as much as I love New England, California's looking better and better. Let me say a little bit about politics and what's going on in this country. You know, when we began this campaign a little over a year ago, people said, well, Bernie combs his hair beautifully. He's a GQ kind of guy. But despite that, he cannot become president because his ideas are too bold and are too radical. Well, a lot has happened over the last year.
So if you've been sick, you know that intensive care is not something that doctors recommend lightly. Boris Johnson is clearly in danger tonight, and that's a bad sign. Johnson is in his mid-50s and hale enough to lead a country. If this is going to happen to him, a lot of us should be worried. And we are worried enough to endure things that just a month ago would have seemed preposterous. Last week, Dr. Michael Ryan, he's a leader at the World Health Organization, announced that in response to the spread of this virus, authorities may have to enter people's homes and remove family members, presumably by force.
In most parts of the world, due to lockdown, most of the transmission that's actually happening in many countries now is happening in the household, at family level. In some senses, transmission has been taken off the streets and pushed back into family units. Now we need to go and look in families to find those people who may be sick and remove them and isolate them in a safe and dignified manner.
How dare you?
Shame on you.
Just so you know, we're coming to your house, seizing your children, and, quote, isolating them in a safe and dignified manner, whatever that means. Now, that's not something that under normal circumstances officials casually drop during briefings. It's the kind of statement that might trigger violence. People don't respond well when you threaten to take their kids. But Ryan said it like it was no big deal, and that's how the media treated it. His threat didn't make headlines in any of the major newspapers in this country. That's the kind of moment we're in. So how long will this moment last? Well, on Friday, Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, predicted that the first in a series of lockdowns will go on until June.
One of the things that just concerns me, it's not one of those immediate concerns, but is, you know, this draws out through the summer, and then the cold weather comes around, and then there's another wave of it. How do you, as a leader, how do you think about this?
Early on, when people said, is this just going to be a few days or a couple weeks, I said, no, I think it's at least 2 months. And I said, if we're successful in this, we can expect a second spike in the late fall or early winter. That's how viruses work. We better steel ourselves for a second and maybe even third round of this. But we also need to be nimble enough to know we're not going to flip a switch one day and turn the economy back on.
A quote, second and maybe even third round of lockdowns. That's a long time. Former Obama official Jason Furman, who's now an economist at Harvard, predicts the disruption may be even more severe than that. Quote, we should certainly be prepared for a meaningful level of deliberate suspension of economic activity for the rest of the year. Well, it would be nice to know that there's a good reason for all of this. Of course, everyone wants there to be a good reason, sincerely. Yet the arguments for a prolonged national lockdown are starting to sound strained. In a much-discussed article on Medium recently, two academics from Pittsburgh argued that lifting the lockdown at all, even many months from now, would be negligent. Quote, as long as a large majority of the population remains uninfected, lifting containment measures will lead to an epidemic almost as large as would happen without having mitigations in place at all. Well, that sounds plausible when you read it. In fact, it sounds like science. But is it science?
We choose science over fiction. We choose truth over facts.
A large majority of the population remains uninfected, they say. But is that true? We don't know it's true. As of today, nobody can say what percentage of the American population is infected or has been infected. There haven't been large-scale randomized tests conducted here. We don't even know when the disease first arrived in the United States. There's informed speculation that this strain of coronavirus has been here since late November or December. Authorities traced the first confirmed case to January 15th in Washington state. An unnamed 35-year-old Chinese immigrant landed in the United States after visiting his family in Wuhan and wound up in a hospital outside Seattle. Apparently, he recovered. Now, depending on how you count, the virus has been circulating among us for up to 4 months now. For most of that time, there was no systematic attempt to quarantine the population. How many Americans were infected over that period? Again, we don't even have a ballpark number for that, but the number could be enormous because the virus turns out to be much easier to transmit than we thought it was. On Friday, you may have noticed the CDC issued new guidance on mask use. The government now recommends wearing, quote, cloth face coverings in public. Why'd they make that change? Because researchers are learning more about how this virus moves from person to person. Scientists now believe the coronavirus can be transmitted by someone who shows no symptoms merely by speaking. Remember when they told you that hand washing was the key to staying safe? That recommendation was based on the belief the virus lived mostly on surfaces, and that's not the case. We're still not exactly sure how the virus is spread, but among some populations, and this is interesting to know, it appears to be astonishingly widespread. An article in the Italian media last Thursday, for example, described a blood drive in a village in Lombardy. That's in the northern part, the most infected part of the country. Of the 60 people who showed up to give blood, 40 tested positive for coronavirus. None had shown symptoms of it. None knew they had it. Keep in mind that Lombardy has been strictly locked down by government order since March 9th. That's almost a month ago. Yet about 70% of this group got it anyway. A report from Hong Kong in February suggested that a woman diagnosed with the coronavirus may have infected others 10 floors away in the same apartment building, even though she never came into contact with any of them. Health officials concluded the virus likely traveled through plumbing pipes to different apartments. And it wasn't a wild guess. In 2003, an outbreak of SARS spread the same way. So it's starting to look like the coronavirus is more transmissible than we expected or were told. The good news is it also seems far less lethal overall. People are still dying in large numbers. Not all of them are sick or old, and that's terrifying to watch. But as the data trickle in, there's evidence that many infected people are not sick. Iceland has tested a larger percentage of its population than any country in the world. They've tested about 5% of all citizens. The United States, by comparison, has tested 0.3%. So far, about half those who've tested positive in Iceland have been completely asymptomatic. So given all of this, what is a wise response to this pandemic? Historically, health officials have used quarantines to contain infectious diseases. Until now, a quarantine consisted of separating the sick from the general population and then doing everything possible to protect the especially vulnerable. In this case, that would include the elderly and the immunosuppressed, among other groups. We have a pretty good idea that targeted quarantines work. They've been used for centuries around the world. But that's not what we did. Instead, the United States and many other countries instituted mass quarantines in which governments shut down entire nations for long periods. That's never happened before. Now, mass quarantine makes sense if you're fairly certain it will prevent mass infection. But are we certain of that? Well, despite what you might hear on television, we are not certain of that still. In fact, there are some indications it hasn't been as effective as we'd hoped it would be. Italy imposed one of the toughest lockdowns in Europe. Almost a month later, as we just told you, an overwhelming majority of at least one town has been infected with the virus anyway. Now, it's possible to imagine that a mass quarantine might stop transmission of a virus. It might work if it actually separated people, if citizens were forced to stay in their homes and not have any interaction with other people. But we're not doing that in the United States. We never will do that here. Too many Americans live alone, for one thing. People would starve to death.
How dare you?
Instead, the directive we're living under is this: stay home except to buy food. The one place you can go is the supermarket, where, by the way, everyone else in your neighborhood has been this week. From an epidemiological standpoint, this is lunacy. If you wanted to infect an entire population, you'd encourage everyone in a specific zip code to meet regularly in one enclosed location. It doesn't make sense. Authorities must know it doesn't make sense, that's obvious, but instead of changing course or fine-tuning, they're doubling down, hoping that vehemence will compensate for bad science. Here's the mayor of Los Angeles just last week.
If you've observed recurring violations of the Safer at Home order, please continue to let us know at coronavirus.lacity.org/business-violation. You know the old expression about snitches? Well, in this case, snitches get rewards. We want to thank you for turning folks in and making sure we are all safe.
Shame on you.
So you just saw the mayor of our second biggest city offering to pay citizens to snitch on their neighbors for, among other things, daring to go to work.
How dare you?
Working is one activity we've decided should not be allowed. Jogging, fishing, golf, fine. Being employed, a massive threat to public health. We've decided that offices are somehow more dangerous than supermarkets, far more dangerous, though no one has to date bothered to explain how. The result of this? By some estimates, more than 17 million Americans are unemployed right now. That's the highest number in the history of this country. A year from now, and we should think about this, how will all of us feel about the decisions we've made in the face of this pandemic? Is there a single person who sincerely expects that coronavirus itself will hurt more people in the end than the damage we're causing in our response to it? Probably not. Mass unemployment is almost certain to cause far more harm, including physical harm, to the average family than this disease. In 1967, two psychiatric researchers decided to rank traumatic life events in order of how profoundly they affected people's health. Stress can kill you, we know that, and they wanted to determine which kinds of stress were the most dangerous. The doctors found that losing a job ranked high on the list of health-degrading traumas. Joblessness came in well above death of a close friend, to put it in some perspective. If you ever found yourself unemployed with dependents to take care of, you understand this. Unfortunately, many of our policymakers don't understand. They've never been in that position. They never will be. Our professional class doesn't have much interest in middle-class job loss or its consequences. We know that because they've essentially ignored it for decades, not to mention the family disintegration and the drug epidemics it has spawned. So far, about 10,000 Americans have died from the Wuhan coronavirus. That number will rise, and it will likely include people you know. That's a tragedy. But it's not the only tragedy in progress in this country.
Lying dog-faced pony soldier.
In 2018, more than 67,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. The year before, more than 70,000 died. That's more than the entire population of the towns most of us grew up in. And those totals are far lower than the real number, according to people who study the question. The drug epidemic has permanently changed the demographics of this country, but for some reason, CNN has not kept a running tally of drug casualties on the screen. Why is that? Well, you know why. It's not their peer group. It doesn't seem real. They're not that interested. And the same thing is going on now. If the coronavirus shutdown was crushing college administrators or nonprofit executives or green energy lobbyists, it would have ended last week. Instead, it's mainly service workers and small business owners who have been hurt, and they're not on television talking about what they're going through. You need to look closely to see their suffering. Over the weekend, the head of Indiana's Family and Social Services Administration announced that calls to the state's mental health and suicide prevention hotline had gone from about 1,000 to 25,000 a day. Calls to Indiana's addiction hotlines have risen dramatically as well. Reports of domestic violence have spiked in this country and, in fact, around the world. In France, they rose 32% in a single week. Someday we'll get the numbers on the child abuse going on during this lockdown, and we'll all feel sick to our stomachs. Once again, coronavirus is not the only bad thing that's happening in America right now, horrifying as it is. We should never minimize the danger of this pandemic or minimize our obligation to respond to it wisely. We've been saying that on this show for months. No thoughtful person wants to reopen baseball stadiums tomorrow or book a cruise to Shanghai. But there has to be a more balanced course than the one we are on now. For most people, going to work cannot be more dangerous than buying produce at Safeway twice a week. And if it is more dangerous, tell us how it is more dangerous, and be specific when you describe that. Otherwise, it's time to start caring about the entire population. Healthy people are suffering badly too. Well, for weeks and weeks, as this pandemic spread through our country, senior American health officials kept telling us something that wasn't true. And it was obvious it wasn't true. They told us that masks didn't work. They said that somehow masks needed to be conserved for the sick and for healthcare workers. That was critical. But for everyone else, they were useless. In fact, they said masks increased the odds of you getting sick. The Surgeon General told us this.
The World Health Organization and the CDC have reaffirmed in the last few days is that they do not recommend the general public wear masks. Wearing a mask improperly can actually increase your risk of getting disease. It can also give you a false sense of security. So we want to make sure we are reserving PPE for the people who most need it.
If you want to put that aside for healthcare workers, we get that. But if it could actually help us, we would love to help.
But again, the data doesn't show that it helps individuals.
That was insulting nonsense. There weren't enough masks. They didn't want to say it, and so they patronized us and devalued their own credibility, the one thing you really need in a crisis, by lying to us in a way that anyone with Google could have disproved. Years of research, including studies by our own government, have found consistently that masks are useful, both for keeping the sick from spreading the disease and keeping the healthy from catching it. That's why they make masks. That's why people use them. The CDC has finally walked back this obvious lie. But it's not just the CDC and our Surgeon General who have lost credibility. The World Health Organization told the same lie. Watch this.
Generally recommend the wearing of masks in public by otherwise well individuals because it has not been up to now associated with any particular benefit. It does have benefits psychologically, socially, and there are social norms around that, and we don't criticize the wearing of masks and have not done so. But there is no specific evidence to suggest that the wearing of masks by the mass population has any particular benefit. In fact, there's some evidence to suggest the opposite. In the misuse or wearing a mask properly or fitting it properly or taking it off and all the other risks that are otherwise associated with that.
Fool me once. Shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
What a liar. And for perspective, that's the same guy, just in the last segment we showed you on tape, saying that the World Health Organization reserves the right to come into people's homes and take their family members by force. Okay. But wearing masks is wrong. They told you that on March 30th. And already at that point, South Korea and Taiwan had essentially contained their outbreaks. Have they done that? In part by producing a huge number of masks and making people wear them. But the World Health Organization was still pushing that nonsense. That's not a surprise. It shouldn't surprise you, because you know the World Health Organization has spread many lies, including China's lie that coronavirus couldn't transmit person to person, that the virus was under control, that travel restrictions were just racism. In fact, you could argue that coronavirus might have been slowed or stopped by now if the World Health Organization wasn't so incompetent. At times, it seems like they're doing whatever they can to keep it spreading.
These people are sick.
Senator Rick Scott represents the state of Florida. He'd like to investigate the World Health Organization for what it's done in response to this pandemic. Senator, thanks so much for coming on tonight. Tell us why you believe the World Health Organization is in part culpable for this disaster.
Well, first off, they just work for China, Communist China. First, they said on January 14th in a tweet that there was no evidence that there was human-to-human transmission. Lie. Then they said, I think on the 20th or something, China's doing a great job. Lie. I asked them, and then when Trump did the right thing by doing the travel ban, they attacked Trump for doing the wrong thing. I asked them to do an investigation of China back in February. I started talking about this like you did back in January. Did they ever do it? No. If they had done their job, everybody would have gotten more ready. We wouldn't have shut down this economy, and we wouldn't have all these people dead all over the world. So I want an investigation. I'm on Homeland Security. I've talked to the chairman, Ron Johnson. He's agreed to do it. We're going to investigate why did they do what they did, what was their purpose, and why are we, as American taxpayers, giving them some of our dollars?
Yeah, I mean, Bill Gates, who is the single largest donor, I think he gives more than anybody other than the United States to the World Health Organization, is out there this week saying the lockdown needs to continue indefinitely. Why are the people affiliated with the World Health Organization still treated as serious people when so many of them are liars and buffoons?
Well, first off, one thing, we should never, ever buy one more product from China. When you buy a product from China, you have to say, that's the group of people, all right, that completely lied to us and forced us to shut down our economy and killed American citizens and Italians and Spaniards on top of stealing all of our jobs before. They lie, and the WHO is standing right up there with them, helping them. They parroted whatever Communist China said.
How long are we going to continue to fund this organization, do you think?
I hope this is the last year. And by the way, not only do I not want to fund the WHO, first, let's get the information. I can't imagine it's going to get any better than what we already know. But why are we funding organizations that are lying to us? I think we pay about 21% of their budget. China is way less than 1% of their budget. So what's going on here? Why are they parroting what China's doing? And did they follow their protocol? I doubt that they followed their protocol for pandemics. I bet the WHO didn't do it, and why didn't they do it? So, and by the way, we've got to create an American delivery system for pandemics, for protective gear, for ventilators, for therapeutics. Stop this stuff of relying on China for anything.
Senator, thanks so much for that. Great to see you tonight.
Thanks, Tucker.
As you all know, this pandemic began in China. There is some evidence from the Chinese that it came from a lab in Wuhan, accidentally. They certainly lied about it at the early stages. They told us it couldn't be spread person to person. They lied about how many cases they had, how many people died from it. They got the World Health Organization to endorse those lies. Thanks to all of this, the rest of the world had inaccurate information about the Wuhan coronavirus and was unprepared, and many thousands died. So this pandemic is the direct fault of the government of China. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying or shilling for an appalling regime. Now the world has suffered tens of trillions of dollars in economic damage, and China, of course, should foot the bill for that. How could we make that happen? Gordon Chang is the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and he joins us tonight. Gordon, thanks so much for coming on. This is one of those ideas that sounds on the face of it far-fetched just because people doubt justice will ever be done in any circumstance. But there are ways that we could make China pay for this. What are they?
Well, there's certainly ways, Tucker. And one of them is that China has a lot of liquid assets around the world. It has more than $1 trillion in treasuries, for instance, and it has money in euros, pounds, yen, Swiss francs, probably Canadian dollars. And if we acted with the issuers of those currencies, we could seize a fair amount of money. Now, it would never compensate the world. You just can't compensate the lives that have been lost. And even the monetary compensation is not enough for the trillions of dollars in damages that you talked about. But we need to create a deterrent. We need to deter future regime leaders from thinking that they can do something like this and get away with it.
So you mentioned that they hold over $1 trillion in treasuries, in our debt. Why wouldn't we just unilaterally forgive our own debt?
Well, if we were to do that, and we could easily do it, China would do a couple things. First of all, it would say that it was a repudiation of debt, and then they would bash us. They would say that we're not a responsible member of the global financial system. They would then try to dethrone the dollar. Now, yeah, I can understand what you're thinking, but the point is that we can sort of avoid those types of charges if we work with the issuers of the other major currencies, and then China is left with no arguments in that regard. It sounds hard to do that, but nonetheless, when we see what's happening in England right now, especially to the Prime Minister, I think that the anger there is enough so that we could actually build that coalition to actually get the other issuers to work with us.
Boy, I think that sounds absolutely worth doing. Gordon Chang, thank you tonight and for every night you've been on. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Tucker.
Now look at this, in an exclusive letter obtained by Dr. Oz, highly respected, Los Angeles-based rheumatologist who he trusts. When you see his credentials, they're unbelievable, named Daniel Wallace, sent a letter to the FDA explaining, quote, hydroxychloroquine is a very safe drug. It has been given to tens of millions of individuals in the world since its approval in 1955. That's 65 years ago. Monotherapy has not been associated with any deaths in the recommended dose. In 42 years of practice, no patient of mine, it took over the largest lupus practice in the country, has ever been hospitalized for an HCQ complication. Dr. Wallace added, quote, rheumatologists, well, do not obtain EKGs before prescribing HCQ and never had a problem. No treatment guidelines suggest obtaining it. And also look at this. Hydroxychloroquine is rated the most effective therapy by doctors for coronavirus, and according to a new survey, and in Michigan, doctors are seeing success. Out of Los Angeles, you got a doctor named Anthony Cardillo. By the way, California did a great job. Got to give California, Gavin Newsom, credit. His handling of this far superior to what they did in New York. He's saying, by the way, promising results in prescribing hydroxychloroquine in combination with zinc to patients severely ill with the virus. He told ABC7 Los Angeles, quote, every patient I prescribed it to has been very, very ill, and within 8 to 12 hours, they were basically symptom-free. Also breaking tonight, a Michigan State representative, a Democrat, Karen Whitsett, is crediting hydroxychloroquine in the president's bold efforts for saving her life after her battle with coronavirus. Well, we're glad you're doing well, Congresswoman, or I guess state rep. Here's the question. Let's let doctors and patients decide. Give our medical professionals all the tools they need to succeed. Access to potentially life-saving drugs and supplies and equipment. But of course, there are people in the Democratic Party, the mob, and the media. Well, they continue to smear the president in sick, ugly, and twisted ways. Look at one far-left Ohio state lawmaker who's actually claiming the president touting hydroxychloroquine is a crime against humanity, tweeting, quote, well, I've been to The Hague. I'm making a referral for crimes against humanity tomorrow. Today's press conference was the last straw. I know the need for prosecution referral when I see one. And if that isn't nutty enough, Conspiracy Theory TV is even suggesting the president has secret financial interests in life-saving drugs. Even in the middle of a national emergency and a pandemic, they can't help themselves. Take a look.
Why is the president so convinced that this is the medication that needs to be stockpiled? What is in it for him?
This is the death of expertise. Yeah. This is when the idiots have been exposed.
This drug that the president keeps pushing, a lot of people would say, follow the money. There's got to be some sort of financial tie to someone somewhere that has the president pushing this repeatedly.
This was a 9/11 level failure of the federal government. It was. It needs to be talked about and covered and scrutinized that way.
These people are sick.
Anyway, it's not even worth listening to these people anymore. Facts, they no longer matter to the left. Truth doesn't matter. Reason, common sense doesn't matter. It's all Trump derangement syndrome every second hour of every 24-hour day, and the levels are shocking and disturbing.
And the only cure for that Trump derangement syndrome is 4 more years.